Thanks, Steve, and hello, everyone. So Ollie and I have been working together over the past couple of years as Redington have been onboarding Ford onto their ADA platform and collaborating on developing how it's used in the global pensions and governance space. It feels like we've tackled quite a lot in that time, Ollie.
Yes, it's definitely been a busy couple of years. I've aged a lot since that photo that was on the screen. Not sure if that's the effect of this project or everything else that's happened over the last couple of years. But overall, it's been one of my favorite projects. I think that's partly due to the collaborative process that we've been through, and also because it feels like we've created something that changes the way we look at pensions with a pretty unique solution. So I'm looking forward to walking through the now, near, and far of this project, which is a terminology that we've used a lot at Ford recently and sets out what we've been doing, which is the now, where we're going next, which is the near, and then the more interesting bit, what the future could hold, so the far. So hopefully this now, near, far view will give a great way to bring the project to life and discuss what the future may hold.
Yeah, definitely. And we really set ourselves a tough task, make a pension system which is user friendly and drives adoption and engagement as a result of this. And I guess that's a byproduct of having seen too many of these projects fail to deliver value because nobody actually wants to use them.
Yes, sadly that does happen. I think this is often because an iterative approach isn't adopted. So you can end up trying to create something that's all singing, all dancing, absolutely perfect on day one. And actually, it's much better to put the hard work into making something that's simple and engaging. And then you iterate to add in new features as needed. So you get this eternal pursuit of perfection, which gives a much better output.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of looking at it, actually. Do you want to wind the clock back and talk us through how the project started?
Sure. So it all started really with trying to think differently about pensions. I think Ford, like most large companies, we tended to see pensions as a legacy issue and a compliance problem. So we have lots of firefighting and what I'd call retrospective thinking. So always looking back on our accrued problems. And typically, if a problem or a challenge would come up in relation to a certain pension plan, we then all run around gathering all the data about that plan, trying to understand the solutions, coming up with a fix for that, and then moving on to the next challenge. So what we'd never done before is turn that around and try to take a prospective or forward-looking approach to pensions.
Yeah, it was a really interesting challenge for us as technologists as well. So with hundreds of pension plans around the world, about $1 billion worth of pension spend each year, there's obviously a mountain of great data available. And using data analytics, we could start to drive insight and understanding for each of these plans and try and get our heads around the global pensions footprint in a way that hadn't really been done before. I know a lot of this sounds great in theory. In practice, there was a lot of work for Redington and Ford to bring all of this data together. So we thought maybe we'd share a video with you that brings to life a little bit what we've been working on.
So that was great. I really like that video. It shows how we've thrown mountains of pensions at Ada, mountains of pensions data at Ada, and it's given us a few different things. I think number one is a comprehensive view of all of our pension plans, which is something we didn't have before. Number two is a set of metrics to measure and understand the plans on a consistent basis. So one of those metrics is a score out of 100 for each of our pension plans based on various different performance factors. And also we get a single source of truth on pensions. So as I was saying previously, we had to run around digging out bits of information from multiple different sources and different people. Now we have one place where all of that data is. And that also gives us an insight into the cost for Ford of all of our pension plans, which is something we had a good grip on, but also the value to pensions. So looking at how much value each employee would get as a pension at retirement. And that in turn gave us the ability to identify the best areas to focus on now that we understood where there may be issues and we could put a value on the size of that issue. And then as I was talking about the way the system's been created, we've also got what I call the power of iteration. So it's a very transparent and flexible system, which means that it's not a black box for us. We're never getting to the point of this is just the answer that Ada gives us. We're always able to understand where that data came from, why that is the answer, and improve it at any stage by updating the data or changing the methodology.
Yeah, and that's so important if people are going to trust the system, if they're going to trust the output, that's just kind of fundamental to it, isn't it? So that's obviously from a pensions team or a pensions and benefits team lens. What about the wider business? How did they take it? Were there benefits to be had there as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think what was great about this solution is that it aligns really well to Ford's business strategy of using data analytics to improve experiences, both for Ford customers, but also for our employees. Particularly as Ford transitions from stamping bits of metal together to make cars that burn fossil fuels into the future, which is electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, and other new forms of mobility. A lot of that is obviously going to be driven by data analytics. And interestingly, when I talk to data analytics experts, one of their biggest problems is how to monetize the vast amounts of data that they're working with. So our new vehicles are all highly connected. They're collecting tons and tons of data about how the vehicle is performing, how it's being used. But it's not easy for people to turn this into something that's got a real dollar value to our customers or to Ford. Interestingly, with data analytics and pensions, the majority of our data is already monetized. So it's cost to Ford, it's value to our employees. It's kind of already gone through that hurdle of turning it into a monetary value. And this makes the senior buy-in conversation just much easier because we can easily put a value on everything that we're trying to do.
Yeah, and I guess that helps you tie value to the technology project in and of itself and really justify that. So what are your kind of key takeaways from the project? What have we learned from all of that as an organization?
Yeah, good question. So I think the short answer is we've learned a lot, but actually we're still learning every time we use the system. The slightly longer answer is that our conclusions probably break down into three main areas. So number one was when we plotted out all of our pension plans around the world, there was no obvious patterns of pension design. As you'd expect, we had a very large mix of defined benefit, defined contribution, hybrid plans, some of them paying lump sum, some of them paying monthly. Understandable reasons for each of the designs on their own. But when you stood back, there was no clear consistency or sort of philosophy for the benefit design, which was an interesting conclusion. Number two is we have a very big concentration of cost. So the vast majority of our pensions funding, about 80%, goes to our three largest defined benefit plans, which only covers about 15% of our employees. So that was another one of once we'd actually gathered the data, it was really interesting to see where most of the money was going. And then the third one was the uncertainty of the defined contribution schemes and the future for them. So pulling all the data together, we saw that nearly half our employees are now in defined contribution plans. As you'd expect with a manufacturing company, still got a large amount of defined benefit employees. But these defined contribution plans had a very large range of member outcomes. So at the top end, our most generous plan was providing pensions of around 50%, 57% actually of pay at retirement, compared to our least generous plan, which was more like 5% as a replacement ratio. So that was quite a broad spectrum. Given defined contribution is our future, it was interesting to see that we had such a range there. But really, as I said, we're just getting started on all of this.
Yeah, that's really interesting to get those kind of learnings from it. I suppose back to this concept of now, near, far. If that is now, what's near term for us? Well, what we're doing now is we're looking at an industry first approach to digital pensions governance. So that's designed to take the burden out of the process and ensure that global pensions teams can focus on the things that matter most to them. The concept's pretty simple. Do away with paper-based reporting and traditional governance, and instead use the ADA platform as the basis for reporting, value for money assessment, and governance. So by doing this, we can focus people's time on what matters and also make sure that all of the information and data is in one place with a full audit trail and a decision log around every action.
Which all sounds great, but how does all of that come together in practice?
Yeah, well, I suppose it starts with a framework, and I'll share an example of this on screen. So in order to get there, you really need a mission statement, a North Star for what you're trying to achieve as an organization. This allows you to then set a series of global governance principles, which are overarching and fulfill this. And then underpinning those, you can introduce local variation per country where you need it to be able to support local norms, local taxation, etc.
Cool. So that makes sense at a sort of principle level, but what does an actual digital governance meeting look like in this new world?
Yeah, so perhaps needless to say, it can be remote or face-to-face or hybrid, because with the platform, everyone has access to the same data. And I think we've all learned that we're going to need to be working in that mold going forward. So if we have a quick look at the meeting structure and what that could look like, firstly, when we kick off the meeting, you as a user would go in and you'd have a look at the actions from the last meeting. Obviously, that's usually what we do, is check whether we've actually done what we were supposed to be doing in the first instance. We can then go through and we can have a look at the meeting itself. We can look at the agenda. We can see what items we're going to be discussing, see where they sit within the system, and also see who's going to be attending. Once we've kind of got into the meeting, usually what we're going to do is we're going to start to review the schemes on the platform. So we can see an entire list of our schemes here on one page. The value for money assessment and framework that Ollie was mentioning is on the right-hand side there. So you can see an overall score, or you can see underlying metrics that relate to benefit received, performance, fees, etc. So this could be updated from a market feed. It could be updated directly by the local HR team who are responsible for that. But importantly, what it means is that you can focus your efforts on the schemes that you need to. So you can focus your effort where the schemes have a lower overall score, perhaps, or indeed, if you wanted to do a deep dive on performance, you could look at the schemes with the lowest performance or the ones with the highest charges, maybe. So once we've decided what schemes we're going to look at, what you do is you basically click through to that scheme, and you as a governance committee can do a deep dive on it. So you can see the values that underpin the scoring framework there around performance, benefit received, but you can also see what the member outcomes look like. As we project forward for a typical person in that scheme, what do they get at retirement? But then also for a country norm. So for someone else in that country who's working somewhere else, what's typical for them? We soon found that, comparing the Ford scheme in the US to the Ford scheme in France isn't particularly useful, but being able to compare the local norms in South Africa versus South Africa was incredibly valuable. So that allows us to scheme by scheme work through, to review as a governance committee, and then to make some recommendations around that. You can then do a similar process for funds and investments. So you can have a look at the default fund, for example, within a scheme, drill through and say, okay, am I getting value from this? What were the comments last time we met the manager? How have we been monitoring this? You've got this full audit trail to help you really understand the history of your interactions with the fund manager, how your team has rated that fund. Or you could actually take a top-down view and look at your entire fund range, regardless of where they're being used across your portfolio, and then use that to drive your governance, looking at metrics that relate to the investment fund itself, agnostic of its pensions provision. So that can be really useful if you've got the same default fund across multiple schemes, or indeed to understand the exposure that you have against different fund managers. And then, once you've done that, once you're happy that you as a group have kind of done the right thing, you've done your audit trail, you can record all of the actions, all of the decisions that you make and notes within the system, so that at the end of the session, there is no administrative follow-up, and all the uses have a really clearly curated list of actions. That's all personalized to them. So, when I go and log into my dashboard, I will see the action that's just been created off the back of that meeting. And that means that actually all of my workflow is captured. And then you can kind of redo this process in a few months' time. You can work on those actions in the interim. And really, it just takes a lot of that burden away, but still lets you focus on the things that matter the most.
Sounds great. Thanks, Adam. I really like it for a few reasons. I think number one is that it uses this power of iteration that I've been talking about to address some of the conclusions that we had coming out of phase one and improve the system as we go forwards. But also it goes towards more data-driven decision making and reducing bureaucracy by using this digital solution, which I'm always a fan of. But also it's going to give us extra value as Ford, as DC is clearly the future for us, as all of our defined benefit plans are closed. And it gives us a much better understanding of what's happening with these defined contribution plans, the values to employees, the opportunities for improvements. And this goes back to my original point of we're able to start looking forward and be kind of prospective in the way that we look at defined contribution pension plans, which is much better than waiting till we have a problem and then looking back and seeing what we can do to fix it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we feel, it really moves the dial for anyone looking to carry out pensions governance on multiple schemes around the world, because it gives you the assurance you're doing the right thing without being a huge administrative burden or something that you need to outsource. But I guess if that's the near, where does this take us? And how can we use new technologies to really accelerate this value? So we thought maybe we'd cast our minds to the future a little bit and talk about three potential themes which we could see emerging.
Yeah, so this is where it gets really interesting. As we discuss the far and looking into the future, we've got a great foundation to start building on with the work that's been done already. But taking it to the next level is all about kind of observing trends and seeing what's happening in other areas. One area that's clearly interesting is artificial intelligence. Maybe it's important, though, to define what's meant by artificial intelligence, as everyone has their own version of a definition for this. So you could say a pocket calculator is artificial intelligence in some ways. Other people would see it as just the sort of the really clever robotics end of the spectrum. To me, AI is really about a system that has the ability to learn. So I could see this as something that's able to carry on collecting new data to improve calculations. So estimations or predictions might get a better confidence interval as you get more data into the system, or something that's able to make automated decisions. And again, by collecting more and more data, those decisions improve. So that's my personal definition of AI. I appreciate some people might have different definitions, but then there's a few areas that could get really interesting when you start thinking about AI in the pension space.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I suppose where we might start in the pensions space is predictive analytics. So as we collect more and more pensions data, our ability to model and predict gets stronger. So for example, we can improve how we model member outcomes or asset growth or the risk modeling itself. And we can finesse and improve each of these aspects and then wrap them together with other aspects of AI or cognitive technologies to move towards automating the process and improving confidence.
Yeah, and it's an obvious next step for Ada, as it's set up well to easily collect more data. It's just about connecting that data to improve the predictions. I think another one that's interesting is sentiment analysis in pensions. This is something that Ford and many other big brands use all the time to assess social media and other data for sentiment or emotion about the Ford brand. So if we release a new model Ford can easily collect all the social media mentions of it. So if people are posting on Twitter that they love their new Ford Focus, then it's very easy for algorithms to spot the mention of Ford and then look at the sentimental words in there, so things like love, to put a value on the sentiment based on whether it's showing anger or joy or happiness. And that gives a real-time feedback of how people feel about the Ford brands. So could we try and do something similar in the pension space? I think that is possible. Appreciate less people tweet about pensions than they do about their cars. But if people are tweeting to say things like these new pension rules are stupid, algorithms could easily pick up the mention of the word pensions and then assess the emotion of words like stupid. So this could easily give a really interesting insight into cultures, emotions towards pensions, and also a kind of real-time heat map of what's happening. So if new changes in legislation are coming out, then what kind of emotions is that generating in social media? There's clearly a level of bias for this, so I'm not saying that's a great idea. I'm just saying that's an example of how AI could be used in the pension space. Understandably, not everyone posts on social media about pensions. It's only a special group of people. But it's that sort of data collection and algorithms that could be a really interesting new space for artificial intelligence in pensions. And so, Adam, where else could you see AI being used in pensions?
I suppose we could maybe start looking at self-driving cars as a nice example. So what we're seeing around the world is the ability for technology, most notably machine learning solutions, to begin to act as decision support tools. And self-driving cars is a really great place to start. So it was once complete science fiction, and now it's a reality. And while we may not have full autonomy in all cars as yet, I'm sure lots of people in this virtual room will be working their way along the 6 stages of autonomy that you can see on the screen there, from no automation all the way through to full automation. And even 10 years ago, driver assistance through cruise control was about as advanced as it got you, and that's kind of on the one on this scale. So now, though, the capabilities on the right-hand side are all available in production, and the barriers are in fact legal and regulatory as opposed to technological.
Agreed. But what's that got to do with pensions?
Well, I suppose what we're seeing is maybe an advancement along our stages of pensions automation in the same way. So we start off on the left where the human is responsible for monitoring the pension system. We have no automation. Then we might start automating some risk and performance reporting, and then some automated value assessment scoring, which we were talking about earlier, which we saw in ADA. I guess the question becomes, what does it look like when the automated system monitors the pension scheme? So trouble spot automation might come next, where the system is selecting which schemes we should be looking into. Investment management, so the system reviewing and modifying the investments associated to schemes and members as part of the review process and taking into account member outcomes and demographic factors. And then finally, full automation, where the scheme is self-running, investment decisions are automated, governance is automated, and there's zero human engagement required. And I know a lot of people will be thinking this is far-fetched, but it isn't really about whether you get your scheme to 5 on that scale. I mean, speaking just from an ADA point of view, to give people something real world to hang their hat on. So we're already doing 2. We're able to deliver 3 within the year, and 4 is a viable midterm development based on our R&D program. So while you might not aspire to be all the way up at number 5, it would definitely make sense to be aspiring to move along this line over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like this analogy, partly as I'm a car person. It really works and makes a lot of sense to me. But using that analogy, autonomous driving does have a lot of challenges and fears and skeptics. Do you think it's likely to be the same in the pension space?
Well, I think there's always that risk, isn't there? You know, pensions become self-aware, and we're all fully aware of what happens in the Terminator when that happens. But I guess the key question is, can we take this too far? An example of where I think it could become an issue is the hyper-personalization, what we're already seeing in other industries. So we used to live in a world where product was sold in a uniform shape and customers either opted into it or they didn't. And now we're seeing a level of personalization around the product, which shapes it to fit the customer. Based on what a company knows about you, they'll offer you different aspects of service, different modules, different pricing. In some cases, this is really useful. So I certainly appreciate the fact that Spotify doesn't tee up any country and Western playlists for me. But how would we feel to know that our health insurance was being tailored to us based on data that people know about us, or our annuities for that matter? So in order to put that into something a bit more real world, I thought we could look at this from the point of view of two people, Jason and Kylie. So if we start off with Kylie, she's a gourmand who travels the world on exciting holidays. She eats at the finest restaurants and goes for a run on the beach every morning before her yoga class. Among her friends, she counts some of the best medical and legal professionals in the world. She lives in a gated community with on-site medical provisions. Jason runs a kebab van in Bristol. His staple dinner is doner meat and chips, or maybe a pizza if he wants to mix it up. He plays Sunday League once a week, but he gets subbed off at half-time to save his heart from exploding. His socializing is solely focused around the Red Lion, where he can be found most days, and he lives in the most deprived postcode in the UK. So I guess we can see here what their social media feeds look like, especially Jason Donovan in the top left of his feed. And what's interesting about that is that your health provider, your annuity provider, have access to this data, right? You're basically putting all of this out into the world. So if that's the case, and they decide to actually interrogate the information that's contained within that social media feed, what's the net impact? Well, Kylie gets cheap health insurance, but she gets gouged for an annuity at the end of her life. Luckily, she can afford drawdowns, so probably less of an issue for her. Jason can't get health coverage at all, but his annuity rates are amazing for obvious and very depressing reasons. So sure, it's a stylized example, but are we comfortable with that kind of setup? I mean, how far-fetched is this really?
Yeah, interesting example, Adam. I love the 80s Neighbours reference with Kylie and Jason there. And although this sounds a bit like a sort of a creepy Black Mirror episode, it does to me sound a lot like the social credit system they have in China, where using smartphone data and facial recognition technology, they're creating a national database of individual scores on trustworthiness. So it collects data on negative things that people are doing. So if they're paying their bills late or not paying their taxes on time, or even if they're playing loud music on public transport, or even eating on public transport, they're collecting data on. And that's being offset with positive things that people are doing in China. So if people are donating blood or giving to charity or posting positive social media comments about the Chinese government, that can improve people's trustworthiness scores in China. So this can get very creepy. And there's obviously lots of discussions about where this could go. And although it has its advantages, it does obviously have some serious moral, ethical issues, and also the opportunity for people to game the system if they're trying to do that. So with my pensions hat on, although this stuff is fascinating to watch, you could criticize the pension industry for being slow to adopt new technologies. So as an example, the pensions dashboard is something that the pensions industry has been heavily criticized for not having in place yet. But in some ways, it's to our advantage that we're a bit slower than other industries to adopt new technology, as we've got a chance to observe what's happening in other areas, learn from that, and make sure that we keep the right side of creepiness as these new technology solutions come in. But overall, all of this discussion makes me realize it's a really exciting time for the pensions industry.
Yeah, I agree. Although the industry has been pretty slow to adopt technology solutions, through piggyback off and learning from other industries' use of technology, there's a really great opportunity, I think, in the technology space. And ultimately, it should mean, our conclusions there, the mindset on corporate pensions can shift away from being a legacy and compliance problem towards optimization of costs and benefits, and really making sure that you're sweating the asset that is your pension scheme. The member experience can be massively improved to align with what people expect in the rest of their lives. So, what would people like from Amazon, Uber, etc., making sure that you can deliver on that. And then ultimately, this better management and understanding of pensions, plus the improved member experience, should lead to better member outcomes.
Yeah, so it could be one of these things where we see way more change in the pensions industry over the next few years than we have seen in the whole of the last 100+ years. So just like the car industry, there could be a lot of change coming, all thanks to technology. And this should be a brilliant thing to be part of. So hopefully that now near far storytelling approach was helpful to bring to life the work that we've been doing over the last couple of years and the potential AI future for pensions. Hopefully you can tell Adam and I are pretty passionate about this stuff, very keen to carry on the conversations about the future of technology and pensions. So feel free to contact us through LinkedIn or through any other channels. And I think we're now happy to take questions on any of this.
Wow. Ollie, Adam, thanks a million. That was, I'm not sure where to start. Can we have a workshop on this one, please? That was fantastic. So thanks, first of all, for the video. That was knockout. And thanks also for reminding us of Jason and Kylie. Anyway, let's get on with some the questions. Right, let's start with some nice, easy ones. So what were your killer questions is the first audience question. So not sure if that's one for you, Ollie. Oh, we've lost your audio, Ollie.
I'm double muted. Am I double unmuted now? Good. There we go. So I was going to say the killer questions were actually a really important part of the design process as we worked through this. I think it helped us to focus on the what and the why of how we were building this system. We didn't spend too long designing the sort of the user experience and worrying about colors of buttons. We were much more focused on everything we put in there needs to be able to answer one of these killer questions. And they probably broke down into two or three main areas. The first was really about understanding the breakdown of the pension spend for Ford. So we spend about $1 billion a year on pensions globally. So being able to break that $1 billion down between regions, between countries, right down to the individual plan level so that we could see where every dollar was going and show that in several different ways was very helpful. And then obviously cost is more than just cash. There was lots of different ways of looking at it. There was also looking at the asset side on the defined benefit plans as well. So again, being able to take the global totals and break it down in several different ways, a lot of the questions focused on that. And then the other group of questions was really about the member experience. So retirement outcomes from each plan. We looked at replacement ratios. We looked at value for money. And we looked at an overall scoring system to give every plan around the world a score out of 100 so that we had a chance to have a really good conversation on which one's our best plan in the world, which one's our lowest scoring, and what could we do to try and change the way these plans are scoring to raise the game of some of the lower scoring plans.
Thanks, Ollie. I've got a question from James, probably for you, Adam, actually, and it's, what technologies have you used in developing the solutions for Ford?
Yeah, sure. So I guess maybe a couple of things to touch on here in terms of the ADA application. So from an infrastructure point of view, if you like, it's a cloud-hosted platform that's built in Amazon Web Services. So that's Amazon's cloud infrastructure, which we then license out to our clients. So at the heart of it, it's kind of on the Amazon stack. The actual application is proprietary. So we've developed that ourselves. We use .NET Core as our kind of fundamental programming language. I guess when it becomes interesting, maybe especially in relation to this use case with Ford and with global pensions governance, there's a couple of interesting things we've used, one of which is something called event sourcing. So event sourcing is a way of structuring the data within an application that gives you a full audit trail of everything that happens within the application. So, you know, without getting into too many details, essentially it just records every change that happens. And the nice thing about that is, as we're looking to do kind of pensions governance, what we know is that any change that takes place in the platform is fully available. We can always review it. We can always go back to it. And then you can have quite a lot of confidence. I know when we've started working on this, you know, with Ollie and the team at Ford and also with other clients, there's understandably maybe a concern that if you've got a very robust paper-based process, you want to have the same level of assurance around things. You don't want to, you know, be questioning what the data looked like 3 months ago because you need to look back and it's all changed. So actually having this kind of immutable background to the application is a really useful bit of technology that we've deployed to help us develop the solution.
Thanks, Adam. Ollie, probably one for you, but I'll open it to both of you. And that was Ford's data already monetized, or did you do this prep for this project? And is this essentially assigning a proxy to information?
Sure, and that's a great question. I think yes and no is the answer. So when I started this, or when we started this project, I think I naively thought that as long as our data was in spreadsheets and it was all in kind of currency, we'd be fine, and that would be easy to build into the system. I very quickly realized that some of the data was fine and in just the right format and the right currencies. Lots of the data was unstructured, and a lot of work had to be done to kind of get comfortable with that, to organize that data and to build it into the system. But I think another thing I'd say is one of the benefits of this system, and one of the approaches we took, was not to spend too long trying to get the data perfect, and actually getting it into the system and seeing what it shows us was a much better way of drawing attention to where we may have data issues and what's best to focus our time on, because you could see it come to life in the ADA system.
Okay.
Yeah, I think, and just on that, actually, that's something we see consistently, and certainly where a lot of projects I've seen in the past have maybe gone wrong, is that desire to get the data absolutely perfect in advance. And actually, it's almost impossible to do that because data is very fluid. You're always improving it. You're always building on it. So, with our ADA architecture, we started from the basis that, you could have no data. So what if you only had one piece of data that came to you? How could you start to visualize that? How could you start to understand it, and then to build up from there?
So a few more. I know you had a hard stop. Forget it, Ollie. This is going on for hours now. No, I'm only joking. So next one from Rachel. Does ADA take benchmarking comparison data for things such as country norms from its client base or somewhere else?
That's a great question. Oh, sorry, Ollie, were you going to come in on that?
No, go on, Adam. I was going to hand it over to you. It's all yours.
Sure, no worries. So where we source a lot of that data from is actually from places like OECD and the UN. So there's kind of some global standards that come from there. That said, I know that some firms have their own view on benchmarking as well. So maybe they've got benchmarking reports that they've had carried out for certain geographies or certain roles. So ADA can also consume those. So if you wanted to put that within the platform, you could do that. But actually, it's that core OECD, UN, PRI type data that we feed in.
Okay, this one's probably for you, Ollie. Another one from James. Let me just bring it up on the screen. Excuse me a second. Okay, does ADA rely upon local HR teams keeping the data for regional schemes up to date? And has ADA helped improve data quality via that process?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's another benefit of the ADA system, actually, is that it's very easy for us to keep updating the data that's in there. So again, we were conscious of, we didn't want to build something that looks perfect on day one and then it gets kind of forgotten about and quickly gets dated. So there's lots of ways in the system to update what's in there. So if I'm going through looking at, say, Sweden pensions data, and I notice something that needs updating or is incorrect, I can manually change that, and the system keeps a record what date I changed it and how I changed it. But also it's possible at any point to click a few buttons and get a spreadsheet download of all of the data held in there, and then do updates to that spreadsheet and then upload it in exactly the same format. So on an annual or even quarterly basis, we can do that kind of data download and new upload with additional data, as well as the ad hoc changes as we spot them. So I think to answer the question, has that improved the data quality? Absolutely, because we're now able to change it on a regular basis. But also when you put it into this format and you're lining it up with all the other pension plans around the world, it's very easy to see where something doesn't quite look right when you can see it compared to other plans.
Thanks. Question for you both. And can you kind of boil this down to just one or two practical examples of where you had either some eureka moments or some real practical changes? You talked about member outcomes quite a lot, and I'm from somebody that is involved in a business that is predominantly UK based. I really can't get my head into the kind of jurisdictions that you must be faced with, Ollie. But what will be a practical thing that you can help delegates understand that Ada threw out that you said that means we could do the following?
That's a good question. I think a lot of the answer to that question comes out in the work that we're doing that Adam shared on the phase 2 governance work. So seeing that we had some very robust processes and great data involved with the defined benefit plans, as you'd expect, and quite a mix of quality of data on the defined contribution schemes, and being very aware these are the future for Ford as all of our defined benefit plans are closed. I think that was our kind of, that gave us the focus for the next step, or the immediate next steps, to kind of really make sure we're doing more in the defined contribution space. So setting up this new digital governance process and starting to be much more prospective in the way we think about DC pensions, as we were aware, if we wait too long, we're suddenly going to have a problem that it might be too late to solve. So that's probably the sort of the biggest set of next steps and eureka moments that came out of it. The other ones were definitely on data quality. So as I said, things jumped out pretty quickly once you build it into the system. So there was a few kind of easy wins there where we could say, well, this doesn't look right. And then even other things where it was just a better understanding of how the local system worked. So as you'd imagine, there's obvious defined benefit, defined contribution schemes that look very similar to the UK. But as you start going around the world and you start mapping all of this stuff out, you get some really interesting grey areas where it's kind of quite a unique design in places like Switzerland, where it's this sort of Swiss defined contribution where you've got sort of bells and whistles that make it look more like defined benefit. So that sort of understanding process, again, led to a few eureka moments when we were building this and giving us more understanding of the plans.
And does Ada, does it get anywhere close to almost like the, how do we describe it, the operational elements of data quality? So I imagine within your massive portfolio of pension schemes, improving data quality helps you then perhaps de-risk some of those schemes, particularly if you were moving to a buy-in or a buyout. Does Ada shine a spotlight on those areas to improve data quality, or is it much more high level than that?
Yeah, I'd say it's much higher level than that. It does give us an idea of where things like buyouts, buy-ins might be interesting, as obviously we can see the maturity of the plans through the data that's in there, but it doesn't go down to the level of kind of individual member data being put into the system.
Okay. Another question from the audience. Talking about sentiment analysis in pensions, what kind of actionable information can you use from the emotions and attitudes extracted from social media?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I can completely understand that question. To me, it was one of these things when we were thinking about this of we're plotting out our understanding of Ford's kind of pensions footprint around the world, and then you start thinking about, well, what other data could we bring in to give us more insight into pensions in each country? And so much of that goes down to culture and history of a country and how they've built up their pension system. So it really comes from thinking about where else there might be data. And so sentiment analysis, as we talked about, is something that Ford uses all the time for getting sentiment of our brand. So there was a question of, well, could you look at that in pensions or savings terms to get a feel at the country level of kind of where there's emotion about pensions and what that emotion is telling us. So I'm not necessarily saying that's the next phase 3 of Ada. It was just an area to think about of, there is lots of great social media data out there. People do talk about pensions, and you can get some good insights from seeing the sentiment behind those conversations.
Yeah,
Thanks,
and on that, I do sort of think as well, there's another lens, which is just how much are people in different geographies talking about savings, investments, pensions, like how engaged are different countries around this? Because I think if you do look globally, in some places, retail investors are really plugged in, they're really engaged with things. I think places like China, where actually, not people day trading who have nothing to do with financial services is very common. And then other places where actually people maybe don't really understand what their pension is, and the prevailing view is it's a safety net that's taken care of by the state and I don't need to engage with it. Even being able to drive that insight probably helps in terms of member communications, engagement with staff and workforces. Like what level of information do companies need to share to make sure that people actually get a good understanding and then good outcomes at the end of it?
Adam, you've kind of started really big here, haven't you? There can't be much bigger case studies than the one that you've shared with Ollie today around the world. But for anyone that wants to know more about your solution, does this have applications in more local, domestic operations as well, or is this really a big global system that people should be reflecting on?
No, not at all. I mean, it definitely has applicability in local situations. It has applicability for single schemes. The platform has a whole range of different aspects to it, but they're all around providing a single source of truth for people working in pensions and investments, improving governance, improving member outcomes, improving things like fund selection, fund research, all of those aspects that come together. So there's definitely not a scale point that you need to hit for this to be useful. And yeah, obviously very happy to share information with people afterwards if that would be of use.
Thank you. Adam, Ollie, thank you for the time that you've taken to think through how to present to us today. It's very unique and we've really enjoyed it, as I'm sure the feedback will show later.